whole other group that serves as the library board, but we are the people that are trying to support them, mostly economically, with some funds because this is a completely volunteer library. I mean, completely volunteer. And so we get no funding whatsoever from HOA or anything of that nature. And if you haven't been in the library lately, come look at what all we have. I mean, it's pretty amazing that we think that all of this comes from donations. Today we are doing a book discussion on the book Emma by Jane Austen. And about 3 years ago, help me, Linda, if I'm mistaken, I believe it was 3 years ago, the Friends of the Library started the book discussions. We started out in the library. They started getting too big. Now, obviously, we have a lot more seats available here, but I think as the word gets out, these seats are going to be filled more and more. And so we realized that we probably needed to move to a venue where we had access to PowerPoint, etc. So this is the third of our 4 book discussions for this year. If you missed, in January we did Founding Brothers by Joseph Ellis. In May we did For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. Today we're doing Emma by Jane Austen. And in October, thank you. I knew that didn't sound right, but no. It's not in November. It is in October. We're doing Still Life by Louise Penny. I know many of you have really enjoyed Louise Penny. This is a mystery, thriller, so it's a little departure from some of the other books. Today, gotta get my cheat sheet out here, we have 2 of our own members who are going to review Emma. Now, for those of you who haven't attended one before, let me assure you that you do not have to have read the book in order to attend a book review. In fact, a lot of times it's kind of, I'll go to a book review and then it's after hearing the review that I can hardly wait to download the book or go check it out. So don't ever let anyone think that that's a prerequisite for attending. We have 2 very talented people today, and I would love to introduce you to them. I hope I can do them some justice. The first one is Elaine Kushmal. And Elaine is very well schooled in all things Austen, from what I understand. I haven't had the joy, the privilege of hearing her speak, but I know that she has spoken on at least a couple of occasions to the OLLI group, which is, of course, a national group. But our OLLI group that meets here is out of University of North Texas. And she has spoken to OLLI on the subject of Jane Austen's writings. So I know that this will be something that we will all look forward to. She began her career, oh gosh, I knew I should have worn my glasses. Where did you begin?
Well, which career?
Well, I'm sorry, your interest in, I said career, your interest in Jane Austen.
Well, my interest in Jane Austen probably started when I was in high school, but anyway, I've been a long-time reader of Jane Austen. My first career was actually as a registered nurse, so I did that for 25 years, and then I went back to school and became a librarian, and during school, for the librarian degree, I did do some research and papers on Jane Austen. So it's just sort of gone from there.
It's evolved. It's evolved. Thank you, Elaine. She was also fortunate enough to have visited the very last home that Jane Austen lived in, and she's going to give us a good background, I'm sure, of Jane Austen's background as well as her life. In addition to Elaine, we have Louis Tolan. And Louis Tolan holds a PhD from the University of Kansas and is a retired professor from the New Mexico Military Institute. And I grew up in West Texas, and I know all about NIMI. I heard a lot of things about NIMI growing up in Midland. A part of his focus, or I think a major part of his focus, was on military ethics. And I guess, Louis, you could probably incorporate some things about ethics in today's discussion. He will be bringing out certainly the humor and the irony that Jane Austen is known for. I read the book when I knew that this was going to be the topic, thank you, for today, and I found it a charming book. But I even found it more charming because I knew they had made movies of it. So I cast each of my characters as I read it as some that I knew had been portraying Emma and so on. So let's see if we can do the same thing as we listen to these two. One last thing, I think now would be a good time, Jim, if you would come up and bring we have a door prize. I guess there's a possibility someone could slip in late. We have a door prize, and since it kind of goes along with the theme of Emma, I thought I would give it so that when we finish, I don't forget it or anything. Thank you. So if you have your stub of your ticket that you received when you entered, now we haven't always had door prizes, but this one was very apropos. I'm going to, oh, here we go. Anyone else have one to add? You got two, unless Jim handed you one. And if he handed you one, it's because he put the other end in for you. Okay, I'm going to call. I'm going to go with just the last three numbers. It's easy, I can see it, and it's 444.
Right, there you go. Winner.
We have a winner. If you come right on up. If you will open it and tell everyone what you got. Here, I'll take that, just make sure. Yep. She's the winner. Red, no. Tell me your name.
I'm Sherry Pilgrim.
Sherry Pilgrim. This is you've been to homes, I bet, where they had little magnets on the refrigerator of words, and people come in and move the words around, and they make poetry with the words. These are words that all came out of Pride and Prejudice, or perhaps Emma, but it's over 200 Austen-esque word magnets. So, Sherry, well, and maybe after doing this, you might have a thought for the week every week on your There you go. All right. I'm going to take a seat and enjoy. And if you have questions, I'm sure that the presenters will tell you how they want you to present, whether they want to go the full time and then have questions or to be interrupted. I'm going to leave that up to them. But once again, will you welcome Elaine and Louis.
If you have a real burning question, you could interrupt. Otherwise, maybe wait. Make sure I'm not standing in the way of this thing. Well, I've been introduced. Our plan for the program today is that I'll cover a brief bio of Jane Austen, and Louis will discuss morality of the time of Jane Austen, and then I'll wrap it up with a discussion, hopefully with input from all of y'all. Let's see if I can handle all these things here. I will say I am doing the Ollie Jane Austen lecture again this fall, and it's a bigger version of this with more details about her life and more about how her fiction comes from her life. So if you're interested, you can look for this. Jane Austen was born, though, in 1975. 1775. Just off by 200 years ago. Go ahead. So what was happening in 1775 here? Right. So we were trying to get away from England. And so that kind of puts it in perspective as far as knowing what time period she was in. She was the 7th of 8 children. Her father was a parish minister. If you can look here, though, can you see how many children are in this picture? Well, there's 2 parents. Right. There are 7 children shown in this picture. The second son born into the family, George, who was named after his father, had some sort of disability. It's not clear what it was. He was literally farmed out. Paid some people to keep him on a farm. But he appeared to do okay because he lived into his 60s. So, it wasn't like he was out there and not looked after. But I don't know how much, he's not really mentioned much. I don't know how much interchange he had with the family. Her mother could certainly be busy just raising this many children, but she also had to help with raising a garden for food for the family. There were extra people living in the house because Reverend Austen taught boys, so actually there was a small boarding school, for instance, there. So there was lots to do. Now here is a family tree, obviously, and what I find interesting here is that, let's see if I can find this. Okay, the men, you see how they all have actual portraits? Of course, we didn't have camera then, so these would have been painted, drawn. They all have actual portraits. The women, not so much. This one represents the son George, who I mentioned is not really very much with the family, so he doesn't have it. Jane has a drawing that was done, it's attributed to Cassandra, her sister, and it's a pen and ink drawing. And the 2 Cassandras, the mother and the oldest daughter, just have silhouettes. So it's interesting the way things are different for men and women. Jane and her sister were very close, and due to the fact that neither one of them ever married, they both lived with the family for their whole lives. Though they were apart by going to visit different brothers and different family members and friends, and so they did have a chance to write letters to each other. And we do have some of those letters, though Cassandra disposed of many of them when Jane died. But neither one of the parents, even though both the parents came from gentry, neither of them had money in their own right. So finances were tight. And it was enough of an issue that they gave up one of their sons, and that's Edward right there in the lower middle, to be adopted by some much wealthier cousins. Ever hear that plot point? So this had happened in Jane Austen's family. So we have a young girl who loves to read. She has books available, and her father didn't just keep religious books in his personal library. He got novels, so they had novels. She loves books. Her whole family values books. Other than 2 short stays in a boarding school with her sister, Jane was taught at home from the age of 9. She began writing stories, plays, and poetry when she was 11 or 12. So, somewhat of a, what would you call that? Precocious, yes. Most of her juvenilia is in the comic vein, but she took the writing seriously. She was being funny, but she was serious about what she was doing. She wrote a parody of a textbook history, which is pretty funny, when she was about 16. She also wrote parodies of Gothic romantic novels, and she did some of these when she was younger, but the one that is published that's in that vein is Northanger Abbey. So they would sit around and read to each other, they would do plays for each other, they would critique her, and this all helped her get better in her writing. Just think, there was no TV, there was no Facebook, there was no Netflix. You know, what do you do in the evening? You play cards, you play music to each other, you maybe read to each other, or you read on your own, and that's your evening entertainment. In her late teens, she began to go out into society, such as it was in her country surroundings, and it was probably very much like described in Emma. She does visit family in other towns to attend dances and to meet people. And by meet people, I'm talking about meeting prospective mates. Letters indicate her love of dancing, and she had several young men showing some interest in her, at least at the parties. But in spite of at least one proposal, Jane never married. And there could be various reasons for that. But Jane Austen had a lot of personality and could be what we might call snarky. So I wanted to show just a few examples of that. The Webbs are really gone. When I saw the wagons at the door and thought of all the trouble they must have had in moving, I began to reproach myself for not having liked them better. But since the wagons have disappeared, my conscience has been closed again, and I'm excessively glad they are gone. To her sister Cassandra, on the birth of a son to one of their sisters-in-law, I give you joy of our new nephew, and hope if he ever comes to be hanged, it will not be till we are too old to care about it. I do not want people to be very agreeable, as it saves me the trouble of liking them a great deal. Yeah, wow. And at a ball, Mrs. B and two young women were of the same party, except when Mrs. B thought herself obliged to leave them to run around the room after her drunken husband. His avoidance and her pursuit, with the probable intoxication of both, was an amusing scene. Am I in the way you can't see the screen there? Okay. I think I'm blocking somebody. Okay, well, I want to just mention a little bit that she did have a very close relationship with her father. He was the first person to try to help her get something published, but unsuccessfully. And the difference in the way, even though he was encouraging of Jane, plans were made for all the sons to have some sort of career. Of course, Edward was taken care of because he was living with the other family, and George wasn't in the picture. But the two older sons were sent to university and were trained for being ministers or clergymen. And the two younger sons were apprenticed into the Navy, but that took a certain amount of funds too to outfit them and get them into those positions. What was done for the girls? Really, nothing. And in those times, the best hope for a woman was to marry, but to marry well, you needed a dowry, and there was no dowry for the Austen girls. So they continued to live with their parents in the parish home. Now he got to retirement age. Of course, they're young adults. The older couple made the decision to move to Bath. Now they were in a very small country area, and they were going to move to the big town of Bath. And they announced this rather suddenly to the girls. And this meant leaving behind their community as well as their household goods, including all their books, because that was going to stay in the library there at the house to pass to the next minister, who was going to be Jane's oldest brother. And the piano she played, I mean, she's just leaving everything behind. And it's reported that she fainted when being told the news. So this was a shock and not a good one. They did move to Bath. She wasn't happy about it. But this aerial view shows what a pretty city it is. And the main buildings you see here, the kind of white stone buildings, are from the Georgian period. So they did exist when Jane was living there. Of course, there have been modern improvements since then. But Jane didn't like being there because it was too crowded with people she didn't know. She liked being where she knew people. So, but it did have a theater, which she liked to go to, and there were concerts and there were dances. So there were some good things. I think for her it was more a case of a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. And there's controversy. Some people think she was writing while she was here. Other people think she wasn't. But nothing was put forward to be published while she was in Bath. This is actually a picture of one of the apartments that her family lived in. And it says here lived Jane Austen, 1801 to 1805. So Reverend Austen then dies in 1805. So that's a significant date. He dies. With him goes part of the income, and the women couldn't afford to live in the same apartment anymore. So they moved several times while still in Bath, each place a little smaller, a little less nice. And finally they moved to live with Frank, and he is one of the Navy brothers that's in the Navy, when he was back in England during a time of peace. That arrangement works out for a few years, then a change is needed, and that brings us to Jane Austen's rich brother. And I just went further than I meant to. Okay, so I already said why he had a rich brother, because of being adopted by this other part of the family. He doesn't cut off ties to his family, but he spent a lot of time with the Knights. They educated him. They sent him on a grand tour of Europe, which was the thing at the time. He took their last name, which was mandatory in order to inherit their property. He inherited 2 estates from the Knights. The one pictured here is the larger estate, Godmersham, if I'm saying that right, Godmersham Park. He also inherited the Chawton estate, which was much closer to where the family had lived before they moved to Bath. So it can be beneficial to have a rich brother. Edward had contributed to the women's income while they were living with Frank, as did the other brothers, with Edward reportedly giving a larger share. When that arrangement no longer worked, he offered his mother and sister a home rent-free. He gave them an option of either of the estates, but Chawton being closer to where they lived before, and they would be in a private house rather than in the big estate home, they chose that. And this move took place in 1809. To visit now can be a little confusing. If you see on this sign, it points one way to Chawton House and one way to Jane Austen's house. And I didn't really realize the differences until I visited there. The women lived in what is called Chawton Cottage, and here is called Jane Austen's house. And this is the place. It doesn't look like we would call a cottage, but it is small compared to the big house. And it's now designated as the Jane Austen House Museum. And it's been kept much like it would look when the Austen women lived there. If you can see here, there's a bricked up part, and that used to be a window. You can see how close the road is to the house. And that corner was where their sitting room was, and they didn't want people to be able to look into their window when they were driving by in their carriages. So Edward did get that bricked up. He wanted them to be comfortable, even at some expense. So here's the other side of the house. You can see that this door is a little taller than the other door, and the window has a different casing around it. So those were added when the other side window was bricked up. A door and window were added over on this side. So Jane is back in the small country village. This property had rooms for flowers, a little vegetable garden in the back. She likes this type of living arrangement, and she begins to write again. It was while living here that all of Jane Austen's titles were finished and became published books. Well, 2 were published after she died, but she wrote them here, or reworked them here. After the first 2 books, she began to be known as the author to the people around her, not to the general public. The book Emma was actually dedicated to the Prince Regent at his request. Well, or at least the request of his librarian, saying that His Royal Highness was a fan. Now they say this is the actual desk that she wrote on. You can see it's very small. And I put the second picture in here because this sits in the dining room, back in the corner. See, right back there. So that doesn't look like a great writing space to me, or probably to you. But supposedly this is where she worked, and they said that the door squeaked. And she didn't want it fixed because that warned her when people were coming in, and she could cover what she was writing. And while living here, it is her brother, Henry, who lives in London, who helps her by dealing with the publishers. They self-published Sense and Sensibility in 1811, so probably not her first book written, but first one published. Expenses are recouped, and Jane makes £140. She must have decided this would be her salvation, because she had no money. She is working on Mansfield Park and revises First Impressions into Pride and Prejudice, which is published in 1813. Unfortunately, in this case, the publisher pays her up front, and that includes the copyright. So when this book goes into reprints, she gets nothing. In 1814, she starts Emma, and Mansfield Park is published. In 1814. 1815, she starts Persuasion, and Emma is published. So at this point, she's putting them out like, what's her name with all the romances? Diane Steele, yeah. She never gets to that kind of quantity, but she's working on it. So what did this mean for her financially? For the 4 novels published in her lifetime, she made approximately £600. In today's time, that'd be about $60,000. But that's spread over a number of years. So if you average that out for the years she was publishing, that'd be $10,000 a year. Who can live well on $10,000 a year? Yeah, but it's not in those days. It's equivalent to $10,000 now. She had £600, so she had £60. Over 10 each year if you did it over 10 years. I mean, not a lot of money. To live well then at gentry level, have a carriage, have horses, you needed an income of about £1,000 a year. And she made only a little over half of that for her whole time. I read an article not too long ago that said they had found a letter that she had written, and the auction house believed that the letter, dated in 1813, it's been in a private collection for more than 100 years, will fetch between £65,000 and £97,000. So one letter was predicted to make more than 10 times what she made in her lifetime, which is really sad when you think about all the money that's been made from her writings. What would she have used money for? I think she would have liked to be able to have transportation. that she could have controlled. She had to depend on other people to take her places, other people to keep her, and I really think she would have liked to spend some more money on clothes. She was always talking about having to rework her hat, or turn her collar, or do something to refurbish something. That's no fun all the time. Okay. If you go out of the Chawton Cottage and down the road just a little bit, you come to the Chawton Manor House. Edward's family didn't really spend a lot of time here. It was not as large or as comfortable as the other one that I showed you the picture of. So they were sort of there in the summer. It is now a library for the study of women's literature from the 17 and 1800s. And they do give tours. We got to tour it, but you have to make an appointment, and they only do it a couple times a week. We had to wear white gloves to touch the manuscripts that they had there. Over to one side of the house is the estate church, and one reason there were so many ministerial jobs in England at that time, you know, you're always hearing about somebody's in the clergy, they're in the clergy. If they're not going into the army, they're going into the clergy. Well, all these estates had their churches and had to have clergy. So there were a lot of jobs in that area. As to be expected, the church had a cemetery, which is significant because we have the grave both of Jane's mother and her sister, both named Cassandra, here in this cemetery. You know, Jane Austen died in her 40s. And we tend to think, well, that was back in the 1800s. People didn't live very long then, right? Is that what you think? Well, her mother, who became something of a hypochondriac, if you can imagine a character that has to take care of a hypochondriac parent. Her mother lived to be 87. Her sister Cassandra lived to be 72. Her oldest, longest living brother, Frank, lived into his 90s. So really for her family, she really did die tragically young. So here she's moved to this place where she's happy, and after 6, 7 years, she's sick. She's becoming increasingly unwell through 1816. In May of 1817, she and her sister Cassandra went by carriage the 16 miles from Chawton to Winchester. And the plan in going to Winchester was to get help from a celebrated doctor. Of course, I don't know how doctors then didn't have a whole lot of remedies or a whole lot of knowledge compared to what we have now. But that was the plan. Lodgings were found at number 8 College Street, which backed onto the grounds of Winchester College and was close to the Winchester Cathedral. This house is currently a privately owned house, so you don't get to tour it. But they do put their little plaque up. In this house, Jane Austen lived her last days and died 18th July, 1817. So everybody wants to know what she died. Do you know what she died of? I'm sorry? Okay. Well, the things I've read is the main features of her death, she just got weaker and she had gastric upsets and discoloration of the skin. Ideas for diagnosis include pernicious anemia, myasthenia gravis, and cancer of the stomach. In the 1960s, many doctors agreed that the most likely condition was Addison's disease, and more recently, in the last 10 years, her death has been guessed as being caused by Hodgkin's lymphoma. So I guess as they learn more diseases, they change their mind on maybe what she had. She was buried in Winchester Cathedral. Now, is that not a beautiful building? It's beautiful outside and inside. Her modest funeral was attended by 4 people, 3 brothers and a nephew. The interment took place early in the morning before church services began. Now, today it seems incredible that her sister, who was so close to her, would not have attended, but most funerals during the Regency were quiet affairs with only male members of the family attending. So this was par for the course of the time. As it happens, Jane Austen was the last person to be buried inside the cathedral. She lies under the floor of the north aisle of the nave, where you can still see her simple gravestone. So, you're looking at it on the floor to take a picture of it. What's interesting is that it doesn't even mention her writing, just her personal virtues and stoicism. It reads in part, "In memory of Jane Austen, youngest daughter of the late Reverend George Austen, formerly rector of Steventon in this county, she departed this life after a long illness, supported with the patience and hopes of a Christian." But her fame grew steadily, and in 1870, so this is about 50 years later, her nephew Edward wrote a memorial to his aunt, which was published and copies sold. He used the proceeds to erect a brass plaque on the wall next to her grave. This time the inscription begins, "Jane Austen, known to many by her writing." So today tourists come from all over the world to stand at her grave, memorials to a remarkable woman whose novels so brilliantly capture the quiet drama of human relations. I'm just going to list this chronology. I'm going to read this to you or anything, but these were how many things were published. After her death, the publishers sold their leftover copies, and only 4 years after her death, Jane Austen's books were out of print. So you'd think she'd be forgotten, right? But as printing became more mechanized and therefore cheaper, and as more people were able to read, so there was more of a market for books. 10 years after going out of print, publishers thought there could be an audience for Jane's works. The copyrights were purchased from her sister Cassandra, and Jane Austen has never been out of print since. So, 15 years after her death, from then on, she's been in print. What did Jane look like? We get the books, and they always have a cover, and they have a picture of the art. We think we were cheated if there wasn't a picture of the art author there, right? Well, we don't really know. This is the sketch that is attributed to Cassandra, and this is currently on display in the National Portrait Gallery in London. There's also an idealized picture that was kind of cleaned up. Dr. Paula Byrne, who has written a biography of the novelist, said that the best-known picture, this one, known as the memoir portrait, had always rather annoyed her. It makes her look pretty and dim. You think so? It feeds this whole notion of Aunt Jane, the demure spinster who enjoyed scribbling on the side, but was content with her life in the shadows. Dr. Byrne has come into possession of a portrait of a female writer that was bought at auction. And a documentary has actually been made about this. This is Dr. Byrne with the portrait. It shows a professional with the tools of her trade. You can see she's writing. There's another pen on the table beside her. This picture can't be authenticated because they don't have the provenance. They can't trace it down for sure. Her name, Austen, Jane Austen, was written on the back of the picture, though Austen was spelled I-N instead of E-N. And the other clue is if you look at her nose, it matches her brother's noses from their portraits. So that's a good clue that maybe it actually is a portrait of Jane Austen. She died, as we said, in 2017, and the British government in 2017, she died in 1817. In 2017, they put out a 10-pound note with that picture that some people don't like on it. They also used a picture of, do you recognize the estate they used? It was a Godmover, Shan Park, where she didn't live. Her brother, Edward, the rich one, lived there, and she visited there for sure, but it was not her home. And the quote about reading, I think she really did believe that, but the character that she used it with in the book it was in didn't like reading, and it was said in a satirical or ironic way. So some people don't like that they use that quote. Many other authors have felt like she was really quite something. Sir Walter Scott wrote about her, and he did a review of Emma. 100 years later, Virginia Woolf praised her. She's been compared to Shakespeare. And I'm amazed at the lessons people claim to have learned from Jane Austen. I like a good story, but Jane Austen has her characters learn about themselves and grow as individuals because of that self-knowledge. And I think that's what's missing from chick lit today. And I have a book here, The Jane Austen Education, written by a man too, but talks about what he has learned from her. There's a Jane Austen Society of North America with 65 branches across the U.S. and Canada. There's a whole bibliography, a book listing all the essays and dissertations. She's very popular in academia. And then other authors have kept the stories going with sequels. Such as Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. Yes, that's really a thing. There's been a book and a movie on that. Amanda Grange has gone in and written the men's point of view. This is Mr. Knightley's from the different stories. Elizabeth and Darcy from Pride and Prejudice. There's a whole mystery series putting them into different situations. A couple that relate to Emma. Clueless is a very loose adaptation of, there was a 1995 movie. This book is more recent. Alexander McCall rewrote Emma with cell phones and sports cars. And there are at least 4 film versions of Emma that follow the story as told by Jane Austen. 200 years plus after her death, her popularity continues. Her stories are admired as classics, but also as parts of our current popular culture. I mean, she invented chick lit, for regular. Characters who were forced to grow into better people over the course of the story, and Emma is certainly one of those characters. Okay. That is all we're going to do of that. I'm going to turn that light off and let you talk.
Well, good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? My voice didn't carry particularly well, so if you're having trouble, wait. However, there's a complication there. Some of you understand. I've heard you talk about reading glasses. Thanks to cataract surgery, life is wonderful in most respects, except if I'm going to read the notes, you're going to be blurred. So we'll try to get along as best we can. One of those adaptations really is worth your while is P.D. James' Death Comes to Pemberley. P.D. James is one of the great British novelists now. Most of the time, one novelist just botches the effort to follow up on the first one. James probably is the best of those
But I didn't like that too.
Oh, really?
So, it's all going to be on the
Oh, yeah.
What was the name of the book?
Death Comes to Pemberley.
It's part of that mystery series I was mentioning. Yeah, Darcy.
Okay, let's see if we get these notes straightened out here. I don't mess up the computer. I thought one of the more important questions to ask is, so why do we read? One of the fairly basic questions in life that we tend to slough off. Obvious reasons would be to entertain ourselves, maybe even to distract ourselves, although electronic gadgets do that wonderfully well. We learn facts, ideas, gather opinions. Those are some reasons to read. I'm most impressed with the reason attributed to C.S. Lewis in a film called Shadowlands with Anthony Hopkins. A student in a seminar asked him, or he asked the students, why do we read? And this student, who hadn't been doing very well in his class, said, well, sir, my father's a teacher. He says we read to find out that we're not alone. And that, I believe, is one of the better reasons to read, to discover that we are not alone. Now, William Darius Witz, did you have trouble pronouncing the author? Well, that's my guess. I cheated this morning. I went to YouTube to see if he had a speech, and he was introduced, and I think it's pronounced Darius Witz. Anyway, the spellings. He is, of course, a scholar, and I recommend this book to you a great deal. I saw the title, I've seen it overlay. But it's very, very informative, and it's about a snotty little twit who didn't want to grow up. He was a lit major, and having been through that process, I assure you there are a lot of strange people who are lit majors. Anyway, he insists that he learned a lot about how to grow up from reading Jane Austen. And not that they're a manual, 1, 2, 3 by the numbers, but by inviting readers to see a particular presentation as well. He says, why do we read? Feelings are also the primary way we know about novels, which after all are training grounds for responding to the world, imaginative sanctuaries in which to hone and test our ethical judgments and choice. Reading is, particularly a narrative, is living vicariously, a fancy word meaning a substitute fashion. A chance to get in and explore other situations and ask, how does it match up to mine? Well, we're dealing with a situation from 200 years ago for Jane Austen. Now, Regency England had different manners and traditions, and we've already had a fine presentation on many of those. Now, we should remember, in the Middle Ages, there was no angst about what a boy or a girl would be. Maybe youngsters now are all worried about what they're going to do. Didn't have to worry about it in the Middle Ages. A little girl's going to grow up, live in the same village, and be a mother and a wife. If the little boy's father's a plowman, he is going to be a plowman. No, nothing to worry about. You knew where you're going to plug in. Now, we don't want to go back to that, I suppose, but they didn't have some of the worries we do. Then along came the New World from Columbus, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and it opened a few more opportunities for men, less so for women. But finally there was a chance to move up socially and especially economically. Class still mattered, but there was a chance to move up. Now in this novel, if you've read it, Mr. Weston is an example of moving up. He's worked hard, saved his money, become respectable, and he's coming up slowly in the world. Others sought to move up through marriage. Mr. Elton, one of the two sleaziest past clergymen in all of Austen's fiction, wants to move up, and happily he settles in with a scheming woman well worthy of his attitude. Jane Fairfax is a good woman with dim prospects. Had it not been for the mercy of Frank Bates, who's disagreeable for most of the novel, she would have been a governess. There just weren't that many opportunities. Harriet Smith is a romantic wrapped up in fantasy. She lives in this dream world and gets all excited and crashes, and that's a hard way to live. Others found happiness within their class. Emma Woodhouse, of course, is the one major Austen heroine who's well off financially. She doesn't have to worry about moving up, but she needs to grow up, and she does it at last. Harriet Smith, again, accepts a man of far better character than Mr. Elton or even Frank Churchill. Class still matters somewhat to allegedly egalitarian Americans. We might think, oh, we're all equal, class doesn't matter. Some of you who've been here longer than I have, do you remember a proposal for mixed unit housing east of Wilson Ranch? That didn't go over very well, and I understand that, but we shouldn't pretend that we're super virtuous and don't have some of the same failings other people do. I agree that we don't want that housing, but we're not quite as egalitarian as we might think we are. What abides is human nature. Now, that statement is not going to fly well in most college English classes today. They're off doing some other strange ideas about literary theory, and they don't believe in human nature. I'm old school. I believe there is human nature. It changes very little over time. And we'll learn a lot more about it from fine authors like Austen. Jane's characters think and act with a high degree of probability and even some recognition of ourselves. Again, the test for truthfulness in fiction is it probable? Given these characters, these circumstances, does this seem believable? It's not, can we document it as we have to in biography and history? That's a test there. The measure of Austen's fictional characters is their moral worth. I detest the snobbish, crass Eltons. They are users, manipulators, contemptuous, and I don't think we can like them. I do admire George Knightley for his consistency and directness. I less admired Emma until she repents upon at last seeing her careless self. She's been busy manipulating Harriet Smith, and she humiliates Miss Bates on Box Hill, if you remember that incident in the novel. She reminds me somewhat of a character in the film The Spitfire Grill. I don't know if you've seen that one or not from long ago, who was inadvertently killed, and the man responsible for inadvertently killing her finally stood up in front of the community and said, "I was wrong." That's a strange statement in our world today. How many public figures will say, "I was wrong"? We live in a world of spin and excuses and buck passing. But that was very refreshing in that film. Unadorned confession refreshes the soul. And it does contrast to the spin of our own time. Now, C.S. Lewis, and I am a great fan of C.S. Lewis. I have most of one bookshelf at home with books by Lewis, about Lewis and Tolkien. He advised that we read old books, at least one old book, and then